Okay, so for this equation, y equals 3 sine 2/5 x minus 1. The amplitude is 3. The period is 2 pi over 2/5, which is 5 pi when you simplify. A fourth of the period is 1/4 of 5 pi, which is 5 pi over 4. Phase shift is none, and vertical translation is down 1. Okay, so we use that information. The fourth tick mark, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the x-axis is 5 pi. Half of that would be 5 pi over 2, and half of that would be 5 pi over 4, which matches with what we have right here as a fourth of the period. So every tick mark is 5 pi over 4. So that means that the third tick mark would be 15 pi over 4. And that's one period from here to here. We keep labeling. Remember adding 5 pi over 4 to each at each tick mark. So this would be 25 pi over 4. 30 pi over 4 is 15 pi over 2. And then 35 pi over 4 on this side. And then just label the left side negative 5 pi over 4 and negative 5 pi over 2. Vertical translation is down 1, so it's going to be right on the, it's going to hit some of the numbers. Okay, it's a sine function, so it has zeros at beginning, middle, end, so that would be right here, right here, right here. Maximum is 1/4 of the period, and the amplitude is 3, so from the midline we go up 3. And then for the minimum, the midline we go down 3, and that would be at 15 pi over 4. So it'd be right here at negative 4. So here we have one period, okay, of sine. Now I don't have enough tick marks on the right side, so I'll do half and half. So at 15 pi over 2 is another 0. At 25 pi over 4 would be a maximum. Okay, continues. And then on the left side, at another 0 would be a negative pi over 2, negative 5 pi over 2, and then at negative 5 pi over 4 would be a minimum. Okay, and it goes this way, and there's 2 periods of pi. We have one from here to here, a full period, and then that's 1. And then from here to here you have half, and from here to here you have half. Alright, so for the secant function, remember we think of it in terms of y equals negative cosine. It's reciprocal. 3x plus 2, parentheses there, and then right there. So the amplitude is 1 with the reflection over the x-axis. The period is 2 pi over 3. The fourth quarter of the period is 1/4, 2 pi over 3 times a fourth, so that's pi over 6. A no phase shift and vertical translation of 2, right? Okay, so up here when we answer the questions for the parameters, the amplitude we would say none, but we do use the a as negative 1. Okay, period is going to be 2 pi over 3. Quarter of the period is pi over 6. No phase shift, and it's going to go up 2. So I'm going to draw the midline. Okay, and then and we have to label the x-axis, so it's going to be, every tick mark is going to be pi over 6, or you could just count 4 tick marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that would be your 2 pi over 3. Half of that would be pi over 3, half of that would be pi over 6, and see, it matches with the fourth of the period that we had initially written over here on the side. And then 162636 would be pi over 2. So every tick mark is a pi over 6. So this would be 5 pi over 6. 6 over 6 is 1. 7 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6 is 4 pi over 3. So that'll give us 2 periods. On the left, we could just label that tick mark. Okay, so now we're going to draw the key points. Now remember, this is a cosine. These are the points for the key points for cosine. So it has a 0 at 1/4, 3/4 of the period. It has a maximum at beginning and end, but there's a reflection here, so that those become minimums. So that'd be here on the y-axis 0, 1, and at 2 pi over 3, 1. The minimum would normally be at pi over 3, but because of the reflection, it goes up to positive 3. And so instead of being at 1. And so those are the key points for one period. We extend it to the right side. So we have a 0 here, a maximum in the next one, a 0, and a minimum. Okay, and we don't even have to draw the cosine curve. All we need are those key points. So remember, we have asymptotes wherever there are zeros at the midline. So that would be here, here. When you graph these on a graphing calculator, it doesn't show you the asymptotes, but when we graph them by hand, we do ask you to graph the asymptotes just to make sure you keep the curve in the right place. Okay, within that it doesn't cross over an undefined point. So here you, at the minimums, you go down towards the asymptote. The maximums, you go up towards the asymptote. Again, another minimum right here. And these are all U shapes. They're not V shapes. And then towards the asymptote. And that's it, 2 periods of the secant graph. Alright, so for tangent graphs, remember they look like this with half the period on the right of the y-axis and half on the left. The amplitude for a tangent is none. But remember, we do use the a value when we graph. The period is pi over b, so pi over 1/3, which gives you 3 pi. The fourth of a pi is 3 pi over 4. Phase shift, none, and vertical translation, down 2. So we count 2 tick marks to the right of the y-axis, and that's going to be the end of that period. So, let's label it first. So each tick mark is 3 pi over 4 because it's a fourth of a period. So we're going to do, let's see, half would be 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 4. And this would be 3 pi over 2 because it's 6 pi over 4, and then 9 pi over 4, and then 12 pi over 4 is 3 pi. Same thing on the left side. Negative 3 pi over 4, negative 3 pi over 2, negative 9 pi over 4, and negative 3 pi. Whoops. Negative 3 pi. So the asymptotes, we count 2 tick marks on the right, so at 3 pi over 2, that's half the period. And then same thing on the left side of the y-axis, 2 tick marks over. Vertical translation is 2 down. Okay, so the 0 is in the middle. Okay, at the 1/4 of the period, it goes below the x-axis, so that would be at negative 3 pi over 4 right here. And then at 3 pi over 4, it goes above the x-axis. I mean, well, the midline, I should say, not the x-axis, but the midline. Right here, at the a value, 1/2. So that's one and the other. And then I'm going to draw half of a period on the right and half on the left. So another 0 would be at 3 pi. And at 9 pi over 4, it would be the left side of the period, so that would be half a unit below the midline. And it goes like this. On negative 3 pi would be the other 0. And at negative 9 pi over 4, it's a half a unit above the midline, so it would go right there. Okay, there's 2 periods of tangent. Alright, so, sorry, this is a cotangent graph. And so remember, cotangent looks like this. Okay, so the full period is to the right of the y-axis. The amplitude, we know the answer is none, but we know we're going to use the a equals 2 for our 1/4 and 3/4 of the period. The period is pi over 3/2, which becomes 2 pi over 3 when you simplify it. A fourth of the period would be 2 pi, a fourth of 2 pi over 3, that would be 2 over 12, so it becomes pi over 6. Phase shift, none. Vertical translation, up 1. So we're going to label the x-axis. Every tick mark is pi over 6 units. So pi over 6. 2 pi over 6 is pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 is pi over 4. And 4 pi over 6 is 2/3 pi. So that's 1 period. We keep going because we're going to draw 2 periods. 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6 is pi, 7 pi over 6, and 8 pi over 6 is 4 over 3, 4 pi over 3. So the vertical translation is 1 up, and the asymptotes, vertical asymptotes would be right on the axis, and then at 2 pi over 3, and then at 4 pi over 3. Okay, the zeros in the middle, pi over 3, and then at pi over 6 it goes 2 units above the, above the midline, and at pi over 4 it goes 2 units below the midline, so it would be right there at the division bar. So it goes something like this and like that. Same thing for the other period. At pi, it's at the midline. At 5 pi over 6, it's at 3. And at 7 pi over 8, it's at negative 1. And then just connect them, and there's your period.